If your garden starts looking crispy, wilted, or completely stops producing in the summer heat, this may be the easiest fix you can make. In my garden, I use shade cloth and it completely changes how my garden survives extreme temperatures. So normally sun is great for your garden. Obviously your plants need sun to grow. When you build your garden, you want to build in a place that gets 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. But in the heat, or if you live in an area you have really bright sun, it can actually harm your plants. So it can cause heat stress in the plants when it gets really hot and sunny, and the plants will wilt, they can get scorched, you can get sunburn on the leaves. So that's when the leaves start turning white and then they'll die and fall off. So you can get that kind of damage. And then also it affects the pollination rate of your plants. So especially tomatoes, for example, are very sensitive to the heat, and so like these little flowers on here won't get pollinated once it starts getting hot. And my tomato plants usually stop flowering in the middle of the summer. In July and August I usually don't get a lot of flowers because of the extreme heat where I live. So this can be a big deal in hot climates. You can have plants that are wilting in the middle of the day and just don't produce. So this is why I use shade cloth in my garden, and I use a 40% shade cloth. What shade cloth does is it helps to filter the sunlight. So it kind of tones down the sun, the intensity of the sun, and that helps reduce the temperature for your plants. So underneath the shade cloth, it tends to be about like 5 to 10 degrees cooler than it does in the rest of my garden. So I like to put my more heat sensitive plants under the shade cloth. I also use the shade cloth for hail protection. So how shade cloth works is that it's a woven material. I don't know if you can see it here, but it's a woven material and it filters the sunlight. And so there are different degrees or percentages of shade cloth. So if you go on Amazon or wherever and you start looking at shade cloth, you'll see like 30%, 60, 70%. So when you see those percentages, you might be wondering exactly what you need. And I use 40%. 40 to 50% is a good percentage. That's what I recommend for most vegetable gardens. But if you want something lighter, like you just want a little bit of shade, you could go with 30%. That would be fine. 60% and up, you're going to get a lot of shading, and that actually might harm your plants, might stunt them. It's going to make it really, really shaded, and they probably won't grow as well. So the best plants to use shade cloth for are tomatoes. That's why I have my tomatoes here. I have my strawberries over there. Those are good for shade cloth. Lettuce is good for shade cloth because it tends to bolt in the heat. Certain herbs like cilantro would be good under the shade cloth. I have cucumbers under my shade cloth. Things like peppers, okra, eggplant, they can go either way, especially the okra likes to be out in the bright sun, so you don't really have to cover those kind of plants. Certain cool weather crops, if you have a sudden heat wave, they can benefit from shade cloth, like cabbage and broccoli. Now I want to get into how to actually install the shade cloth. When I first used shade cloth in my garden, I tried putting it on the fence here, and I had like a pole over here. It was a really makeshift kind of thing. As soon as we had our first storm, it collapsed. So the setup that's worked really well for me right now is using carports. So I have a carport over this side of my garden with my more heat sensitive plants, and I got this on Amazon. I'll try to link all the supplies I mentioned in this video in the description box below. But I have this carport, and then I have stainless steel zip ties that I fasten it onto my corrugated metal fence with. So it's pretty secure. If you don't have, obviously most people are not going to have a corrugated metal fence like I do, so you might have to have a different kind of way of securing your post, or if you use a carport like me, you're going to have some way to secure it in the ground. You might use cement or something to make sure that it doesn't get blown away, because this thing is basically like a sail. You don't want this thing like flying into other people's backyards. So I definitely have this thing secured very well. And then in order to get the shade cloth secured on there, I use bungee cords. You could also use zip ties for that as well. The bungee cords are kind of convenient because you can just pop them on and off. The only downside of the bungee cords is that I tend to go through a lot of them because they tend to break down in the sun. Also, you have to think about the size of the shade cloth you need. So you got to know like the size of the area that you're going to be covering. This carport that I have is a 10 foot by 15 foot carport. And then I have the shade cloth that fits perfectly over the top of this is a 12 foot by 10 foot shade cloth, I believe. This one I'm using right now is a little bit larger than that, and the reason why I did that is because when there's a storm, I can pull down the sides of this thing, and then it helps block out hail and stuff, because last year we had a tornado and we actually had like horizontal hail blowing into my garden. So now I make sure I have this side come down so that I don't have to worry about that anymore. So I know that sounds a little extreme, but I live in an extreme climate. Here gardening is almost like an extreme sport. So that's why I have all these crazy things set up, because of where I live. Now I want to talk about some mistakes that you want to avoid when setting up shade cloth. One major mistake that people make quite often is putting the shade cloth directly over the top of the plants, like laying it on top of the plants. This is not going to be effective because you need airflow. You need to have this thing elevated above your plants. And then another mistake that people make is, instead of buying shade cloth, they'll use some kind of tarp or plastic. For hot weather, you want to have shade cloth to protect your plants. Two other common mistakes that I see quite often are, one, waiting until your plants are already stressed before using the shade cloth. And then the last mistake that I see people do quite often is using too high of a percentage of shade cloth, or using a tarp is going to overshade the plants. Your plants are going to be struggling to get sunlight and they're not going to grow very well. So just to wrap things up, shade cloth is definitely a must if you live in a hot climate. It's worked really well in my Texas garden, and it helps extend my harvest of my tomatoes especially. So if you live in a hail-prone area or a really hot climate, you need to get your shade cloth set up very soon. So let me know if you're going to be trying out shade cloth this year. Let me know if you have any questions about using shade cloth. And also please subscribe to my newsletter, and I also have a link for my free Facebook group. I have everything all linked down in the description box below, so definitely check out that description box. I'll have links for everything I mentioned that I use in my garden for shade cloth linked down there below as well. And please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys again soon.